What's going on, Guardians? It's Tizzle here, and in this video I'll be detailing the 10 best exotic heavy weapons in Destiny 2. Full disclosure, I am ranking these weapons a few weeks before Christmas, so any sandbox changes that happen between now and then I'm not responsible for. If there is a massive buff coming to a weapon, it won't be taken into consideration. Bungie has teased a buff to Darcy in the future, and while I personally love that weapon and think it's very strong, it's not featured on this list as it's currently not stronger than any of the weapons in the top 10 in my opinion. But I do hope it becomes stronger in the near future. Destiny is an evolving game, so this list is quite different from last year's. One of my all-time favorite weapons in the Lament was nerfed pretty hard in the final shape, so while it was number 2 on last year's list, this year it is my number 1 runner-up. I still wanted to mention it because it's still a great weapon, but with the introduction of Prismatic, the intrinsic anti-barrier that it offers is less needed than ever with how easy it is to get Radiant. It deals less damage now when fully revved up, and it gives you less health back than it used to. So I regret to say that it's had a sad fall from grace, and it still has the hit detection issues that it's always had, and for whatever reason, Bungie still hasn't fixed it to work on things like phalanx shields. So while it is still a very viable option and a super fun weapon to use, it just misses a ranking on this year's list. But don't worry, Lament, I still love you. So let's start at number 10 with last year's third best heavy in Gjallarhorn. The meta has shifted a lot since I made these videos almost a year ago, and grenade launchers have taken the top spot for meta DPS weapons, negating the need to bring a galley to DPS rotations. Not to mention the nerfs to reconstruction and autoloading holster. On top of this, the introduction of Prismatic has given rise to an ability meta for ad clear, meaning the strategy of using a Gjallarhorn and 2 legendary rocket launchers in a fire team to clear rooms of ads in a hurry is no longer the best option for speedrunning GMs. Now people just spam consecration slams. With that being said, Galley is still wonderful at those 2 roles I just mentioned. Just because they are no longer meta strats does not mean that these strats aren't viable. Bungie made a patch which essentially gave all specials and heavies more ammo, so now Galley holds more rockets than it used to. It is not that this weapon necessarily got worse, it's just that the game has evolved and left it behind. But in no way is this weapon bad. It's exceptionally strong and extremely versatile. It has awesome ad clear, great team support, and respectable single target damage, so it's a great weapon to kick off our list. Coming in at number 9, we have the LFG special Thunderlord. The bane of DPS optimizers everywhere, Thunderlord is the ultimate lazy damage option, and I don't mean that as a slight. I made a video talking about how lazy, or to use a euphemism for it, easy DPS is often better overall than optimal DPS. In optimal DPS situations, one mistake during damage or part of your DPS setup leading up to a damage rotation going awry can throw everything off, where with Thunderlord, you just point and shoot. There's nothing complicated about it. It is also really nice as you can use it for ad clear, making it more likely that you won't die getting to boss damage. And then it has awesome utility with having intrinsic overload. And this thing honestly melts overload champions even in Grandmaster content. And speaking of GMs, I recently used it for a solo GM in Birthplace of the Vile with Spark of Beacons, and that also allows it to apply blind, making it even better. It's just a jack of all trades type of weapon. It does respectable DPS as well as total damage. It has champion utility and naturally great ad clear given that it's a machine gun. It's just a solid all around weapon that works in pretty much all content. And speaking of jack of all trades, Xenophage is next. Xeno is a lot like Thunderlord actually, without the champion stunning utility, but what it lacks in that department it makes up for in even greater ease of use. It is the bane of Threshers and any enemy without a crit. It deals explosive damage rather than crit damage, so it has huge utility on anything lacking a crit. It's especially nice in something like the first encounter of Deepstone Crypt. That being said, because it can't do crit damage, it is basically useless against Tormentors. But aside from that, it deals big damage to anything it shoots and is great for general ad clear, but it can also do respectable DPS in boss damage phases or for chunking down champions. Its biggest weakness is its slow reload speed and lack of total ammo reserves. As a result, it does not have great total damage. I've seen many people over the years asking for a catalyst for it that gives it field prep, and this would be absolutely perfect. More reserves and a quicker reload when crouching. I hope this happens one day. Or for me, I'd prefer air trigger, which is basically just field prep but you jump instead of crouch. Regardless, even without a catalyst, this thing is a Swiss Army knife of Destiny and works for basically any content you want to run. At number 7 we have Anarchy. I mentioned Bungie gave a reserve buff to a bunch of weapons and Anarchy was one of the main beneficiaries of this. Back in the day, it got nerfed pretty hard and was generally not worth using, but it is back in full force in Episode Revenant thanks to concussive reload, allowing it to weaken targets. And you can also use kinetic impacts to stun unstoppables. That being said, even without this, a damage over time weapon is good in basically any scenario in Destiny. I love that this weapon is back and very strong. As I mentioned, you can use it for damage over time, making it a great weapon to use on any champion, as you can swap weapons to keep a champ stunned while Anarchy ticks away dealing damage. And with Prismatic in the game, it's even stronger because so many builds revolve around spamming your abilities, so then you could stick an enemy with a couple Anarchy shots to be dealing weapon damage while you deal ability damage. It just has wonderful utility. It is also nice to pair with a heavy hitting special weapon for good consistent boss damage. In fact, it's so good that my team and I actually used Anarchy and Mountaintop to clear Vesper's host on day 1. We were in the top 60 teams to beat it, and we even had one phase where we did almost half the boss's health. So yeah, Anarchy is a great option for many scenarios. It deals safe and passive damage, which is an underrated but extremely valuable asset in Destiny 2. It's so nice to see this iconic weapon being this powerful again. At number 6, we have a favorite of mine in the Legend of Acrius. Unlike many weapons on this list that have strong utility, this one is more of a one-trick pony. But it does that one trick really well, and that is hit like a motherfucking freight train. As long as you have the catalyst that gives it Trench Barrel, that is. Trench Barrel was recently reworked to work with charged melee abilities, and that made this thing so much nicer to use. I used it in the Lightblade GM with Anti-Barrier Shotgun, and it was destroying champions. It has great total damage and high DPS and is a wonderful pick to use on any close range boss. I think Giggs actually 4-manned Crota on day 1 with Acrius, and Crota was a very tough DPS check on day 1. So that tells you how strong this weapon can be. It's a monster if you're able to get up close on enemies. Now we have the top 5, and kicking us off is Leviathan's Breath. This weapon has had quite a glow up over the years. It was pretty weak when it came out, and buff after buff has seen it get stronger and stronger. And it too benefited from the reserves bump, and it now works with reserve mods. It has amazing total damage and decent DPS with the catalyst, as you can get Archer's tempo going if you're hitting your crits. It can also intrinsically stun unstoppable champions, so it has nice utility. On top of this, the explosion that it does is also great at stun locking bosses. This too is another underrated asset for weapons. It really shines on bosses like the Grasp of Avarice Ogre or the Ogre boss in Warlord's Ruin. I took it through a solo GM on Void Surge and it was just destroying champions. And many people were using it in Vesper's Host on contest mode, as well as for their first solo clears of the dungeon before the meta strats were revealed. And why is this? Because it combines respectable total damage with strong and safe DPS. It is a bow, so you can use it at range to deal good damage, and you have to draw the arrow, so this takes time, which allows you to line up and hit your shot when you go to let go of the arrow. It doesn't require constant good aim like Cloud Strike for instance, you just have to hit the head when you knock the arrow back, making it pretty easy and consistent to use. For all these reasons, it lands in the top 5, another weapon that excels in many areas of the game. Next up, at number 4, we have Grand Overture. Now, Grand Overture has been a total damage monster for quite some time, really ever since it was introduced, but for whatever reason, it never got the recognition it deserved. Hell, I didn't even put it in the top 10 last year, with my excuse being that it feels like shit to use. And you know what? I stand by that. It is a very unwieldy and annoying weapon to shoot, but even with that drawback, you can't deny its power. It quickly rose to the top of the food chain as the best weapon to use on the Corrupted Puppeteer in the Vesper's Host dungeon, and for good reason. Like I said in last year's video, this weapon has solid DPS and amazing total damage. It holds 67 shots at base, which is a ton. And on top of this, it's incredibly easy to use for DPS. Again, like with Thunderlord, it is a lazy person's way of doing great damage. It was actually the example that I used in that video. You can preload your shots leading up to damage to front load your damage and do huge burst DPS at the start of a phase. It's versatile as hell, so you can use it to take down enemies easily leading up to damage. It also doesn't require any sort of swap rotation to deal damage effectively like so many of the meta DPS options do. You just point and shoot, and then do the special reload to fire off a huge volley of rockets. And that volley can also blind enemies, and blind is one of the strongest verbs in Destiny. And it even stuns unstoppables. By far, its biggest weakness is its painfully slow reload, which can be mitigated with things like Actium War Rig or Arc Holster mods. So you have a weapon with champion utility that has awesome burst DPS if you prep it, and great total damage. What's not to love? Well, like I said, it feels like shit to shoot, but the more I've used it, the more I've gotten used to it, and with all its other benefits, it makes the clunkiness of the weapon still worth running. It's a monster. And speaking of monsters of weapons, at number 3 we have Parasite. I adore this weapon. I've been addicted to using it since the Witch Queen released, and it benefited from the changes to reserves more than most weapons. It now holds like 15 shots, which is absurd, and the total damage of this thing is almost infinite if you were to build up to 20 stacks of Worm Hunger for each shot, even though that is quite unrealistic. But the point is, it absolutely slaps. The Worm's Hunger shot can destroy huge swaths of enemies with a single click, and chunk down champions in nearly one shot. It thrives in ad-rich environments, which is pretty much all the new content that Destiny brings into the game. It shines in everything. It's great in GMs, it's meta for Aatrax and any boss with a quick DPS phase thanks to its amazing burst damage. It can even be used in longer damage rotations with a strong solar special weapon and a solar holster mod. It is good on the Servitor boss and Vesper's host. It's just an excellent and super cool weapon all around. I love high damage, heavy hitting weapons, so it's no wonder I love this thing so much. It's truly S tier. So before I reveal the top 2, I want to give some honorable mention shoutouts. I obviously already talked about the Lament, but there are also some very deserving heavy weapons. Microcosm was introduced in the final shape and is really strong, especially after you cast your super, but for me it just shreds through ammo a little too quickly. If it got a reserve bump and maybe intrinsic anti-barrier, then it would be amazing. Sleeper Simulant is a classic in the Destiny franchise and a very consistent weapon, but sadly it's just been power crept. It doesn't hit hard enough to be meta, and it has pretty low total reserves. It's a safe and consistent option for a lot of content, but it struggles to find a niche. Other weapons just serve the role that it provides better. Tractor Cannon is great, especially for optimal DPS, but on its own, it's not that strong of a weapon. And with all the access we have to weaken effects now, its niche has sort of been power crept out of relevance. Sure, it provides 30% instead of weakens 15%, but you can get weakened from so many sources now that it usually does not make sense to give up an exotic slot and take away a powerful heavy to run this. That being said, it is very strong in basically any raid boss fight. Winterbite is an exotic glaive that is very powerful, but glaives are quite niche. The Prospector got a buff and is better now, but still not quite meta, and 1K Voices also got a nice ammo reserve bump, but still struggles to do things better than other heavy options. 1K Catalyst when Bungie. So all those weapons are great, but not worthy of a top 10 placement. So let's take a look at the number 2 weapon on the list, which is Whisper of the Worm. This thing is just so damn good. Much like Legend of Acrius, it's a one-trick pony, but it serves that purpose so well that it has to be highly ranked. It is a DPS and total damage monster. It can chunk down champions with ease and is great on bosses with easy to hit crits. On bosses like Oryx or the Hydra in the Encore exotic mission, it does wonders. Hell, if you know the movement patterns well enough, it's even awesome on the Witness as long as you don't have to unscope. Its downside is that you have to be planted to use it effectively, but in situations where you can just sit back and shoot, nothing is better. I soloed the Encore mission with it, I soloed the Devil's Lair GM with it, people have one-phased Oryx with it, it's just a monster. It's funny, the more things change, the more they stay the same. It was meta in the first year of Destiny 2 when it was introduced in 2018, and it is meta almost 7 years later. And on top of that, it's just such a freaking cool looking weapon. Just one of my favorites in the entire franchise. And speaking of things remaining the same, the number 1 weapon from last year is still number 1 in my books, and that is Dragon's Breath. It isn't seeing nearly as much play this year because Solar isn't really featured on the artifact and there is no Overload rocket launcher. On top of this, Bungie nerfed ignition damage to all bosses with the launch of Episode Revenant, but this has since been corrected, and now it's only nerfed on the Servitor boss and Vesper's host. So Dragon's Breath is back to being a great option. Hell, it even got buffed since the last ranking list thanks to the reserves buff. It has amazing total damage and it deals passive damage. Damage over time is truly one of the strongest effects in Destiny 2, and it allows you to shoot a shot that damages enemies and then you can focus on other threats. This is great versus champions, but also for area lockdown. Ignitions are also extremely strong in Destiny. They provide huge ad clear and solid damage. And like with Leviathan's Breath, ignitions can also stagger bosses, not to mention unstoppable champions. It makes Dragon's Breath a great DPS swap exotic. You can deal damage with the rocket and then use another special weapon for damage, and then it auto reloads itself when you hit 5 stacks of composite propellant. And if you know anything about me, you know I hate reloading weapons, so this is an awesome trait. So it has awesome ad clear, great total damage, damage over time, and utility. It basically checks every box, and that is why it still reigns supreme as the number 1 heavy weapon in Destiny 2. So let's recap. At number 10 we had Gjallarhorn, Thunderlord at number 9, Xenophage at number 8, Anarchy at number 7, Legend of Acrius at number 6, Leviathan's Breath at number 5, Grand Overture at number 4, Parasite at number 3, Whisper of the Worm at number 2, and Dragon's Breath at number 1. And that is going to do it for the video. Let me know what you think of the list down below. It was hard to narrow it down to just 10 weapons, but I think I did a solid job. If you liked this video, then hit the like button, and if you want to see more awesome Destiny 2 content, be sure to subscribe. I also have a Discord channel, and I'm planning to stream on Twitch more this year, so check out the links for those in the description. And if you haven't already, check out my videos on the top 10 special and primary exotics in Destiny 2. I'm sure you'll like them. And finally, if you're still here, thanks so much for watching to the end. I'll catch you in the next one. Take care.